The message came at 3:14 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. T-Hun was the first one to read it. He sat alone in a small, cold room on the 14th floor of the GSC Earth Embassy building in Busan. Empty coffee cups were stacked beside his keyboard. His eyes were dry from hours of staring at screens. He had spent the last 6 hours going through intercepted alien transmissions the way other men read newspapers. Slowly, carefully, looking for things that were not supposed to be there. He found one. It was buried inside a routine diplomatic packet from the Vorath Empire. On the surface, the packet was a formal acknowledgement of humanity's recent induction into the Galactic Sovereign Council. Polite words, standard phrases, the kind of language that meant nothing and was designed to mean nothing. But underneath it, hidden inside a secondary encrypted channel that the Vorath clearly did not expect anyone on Earth to be able to open, was a different message entirely. T-Hun read it twice, then he picked up his phone and called Junho. Junho was already awake. He was almost always awake. He was a tall man with a quiet face and dark eyes that rarely showed what he was thinking. He had spent 12 years as Earth's senior ambassador to the GSC, sitting in rooms full of creatures that looked nothing like him, listening to languages that had no human sounds in them, learning the slow and careful art of saying almost nothing while understanding everything. He listened to T-Hun read the translated message out loud. He did not interrupt. When T-Hun finished, there was a long silence. "Send it to me," Junho said. "Don't send it to anyone else yet." He read the message himself. The Vorath High Warlord, a creature named in their language as something that translated roughly to "he who ends argument," had written to 6 senior GSC council members, not to humanity, not to any of the smaller species, just to the 6 most powerful voices in the council. The message was direct. The Vorath considered humanity's inclusion in the GSC to be an embarrassment. Humans were, in the warlord's words, a soft and mud-born species who had stumbled into the stars without earning the right. He proposed that Earth be formally designated a vassal world, a planet under the protective authority of a stronger species, stripped of independent political standing, treated like a child that needed supervision. The part that made Junho's stomach go cold was not the insult. It was the silence from the 6 council members who had received it. None of them had rejected the proposal. None of them had reported it. They had simply not replied, which, in galactic diplomatic language, was a way of saying, "We are listening, keep talking." Junho called Murray next. She picked up before the second ring. Murray was not a woman who slept much. She commanded Earth's unified defense fleet from a rotating station above the Pacific, and she treated rest the way she treated everything else, as something to be scheduled, measured, and used efficiently. She had short hair and a voice that never went above a calm, even tone, even when she was angry, especially when she was angry. Junho told her what T-Hun had found. He read her the message word for word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you think we have?" "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think the proposal is the threat. I think the proposal is the warning that a threat is coming." She said she would begin quiet preparations, nothing visible, nothing that would show on GSC monitoring systems. He told her to be careful. She told him she was always careful. He believed her. The next 2 weeks moved slowly, the way time moves when people are waiting for something bad to happen and hoping they are wrong. Junho attended his regular GSC sessions and said nothing about the message. T-Hun continued to monitor Vorath communications. Murray quietly repositioned 3 of Earth's deep-range vessels to the outer edge of the solar system. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like anything other than routine maintenance schedules. Then the Vorath moved. It happened on a Tuesday. A Vorath battle group, 7 warships, mid-class by their standards but larger than anything Earth had in open service, crossed into the outer boundary of the solar system and headed directly for Artemis Base, the human research and communications installation on the far side of the moon. The base had 47 people on it, scientists mostly, a few engineers, a small security team. The GSC emergency channel lit up immediately. Several council members sent urgent messages to the Vorath delegation demanding an explanation. The Vorath did not reply. Artemis Base had 12 minutes of warning. In that 12 minutes, the base commander managed to get a distress signal out, seal the inner emergency compartments, and tell her team to brace. It was not enough. The Vorath weapons hit the base with enough force to crack the lunar surface around it. The explosion was visible from Earth with the naked eye. 47 people gone. The Vorath fleet did not press further. They pulled back to the edge of the system, sat there, and waited. It was a demonstration, not an invasion. They were not trying to take anything. They were showing what they could do and watching to see what humanity would do about it. On Earth, every screen showed the same image, the dark scar on the surface of the moon where Artemis Base used to be. News anchors struggled to find words. Governments held emergency sessions. People stood in the streets and looked up at the sky. But there was no panic, not really. There was grief. There was anger, quiet and deep, the kind that does not shout. People went to work. Parents picked up their children from school. Trains still ran. Shops stayed open. It was as if the planet had collectively decided that falling apart was not something it was going to do. In the GSC chamber, an emergency assembly was called. Every council species sent representatives. The Vorath delegation arrived last and sat down without apology. 3 council members gave speeches about the need for careful response and measured dialogue. One suggested that perhaps Earth had inadvertently provoked the situation by accelerating its space program too rapidly. Another proposed forming a committee. Junho sat through all of it without speaking. He let every word land in the room. He watched the faces of the 6 council members who had received the warlord's message. Not one of them looked surprised. Not one of them looked horrified. They looked like people waiting for a process to finish. When the floor was finally opened, Junho stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not use complicated language or long political sentences. He looked at the council, and he spoke clearly and without any emotion that they could read. "We are not asking for permission to respond," he said. "We are informing you of what comes next." He sat back down. The chamber was completely silent. Outside, in the dark above the Pacific Ocean, Murray was already giving orders. The GSC expected paperwork. That was the honest truth of it. The Council had dealt with smaller species before, species that had been attacked, humiliated, had their territory taken, their people killed. The process was always the same. The injured party filed a formal complaint. The Council reviewed it over several months. A subcommittee was formed. A report was written. Reparations were discussed and then quietly reduced. The stronger party paid a small fine that meant nothing to them and went back to doing whatever they wanted. The weaker party learned the lesson that the galaxy was teaching, that the GSC was a table for the powerful, and everyone else was there to watch. They assumed humanity would follow the same path. They were already preparing the complaint forms. Nobody thought to watch Neptune. Murray had chosen Neptune for the same reason she chose most things, because no one was looking at it. The gas giant sat at the cold, dark edge of the solar system, far from trade lanes and monitoring stations, far from anything the GSC considered interesting. For 11 years, Earth had been using the shadow of its largest moon, Triton, as a construction and staging ground. The work had been done slowly and quietly, in shifts, with no external communications that could be intercepted. The workers who built what sat there had signed agreements that made military silence a condition of their employment. Most of them were proud of those agreements. They understood what they were building and why. Protocol IRONVIL had been written 40 years ago by a woman named Colonel Park Sunya, long dead, who had spent her career studying every galactic war the GSC had records on. Her conclusion, written in plain language at the front of the document, was simple. The GSC would never protect Earth. Because the GSC was not designed to protect anyone. It was designed to maintain a balance of power among the species that already had power. A new species entering that system was not a partner. It was, at best, a resource. At worst, a target. Sunya's recommendation was equally simple. Earth needed to build something that made conquest not worth the price. Not the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. Not a weapon of mass destruction. Just enough, precisely enough, to guarantee that any species that attacked humanity would pay a cost so high that no pride, no resource, no political point was worth it. Murray had read Sunya's document when she was 22 years old. She had been reading it ever since. She activated IRONVIL 11 hours after Junho's statement in the GSC chamber. 14 warships came out from behind Triton in a single, clean formation. They were not the largest ships in the galaxy. The Voreth had vessels that dwarfed them, but size was not what Donghyun had designed them for. Donghyun was a small, quiet man who wore the same gray jacket every day and spoke about engineering the way other people spoke about music, with a kind of love that made it sound like the most important thing in the world. He had been building the Aegis-class warships for 19 years. He knew every system on every ship the way a person knows their own hands. The Aegis ships carried 3 primary weapon systems. The first was an electromagnetic pulse core, a device that could send a directed, focused EMP burst at a specific target with enough precision to shut down a ship's systems without destroying the hull. The second was layered adaptive shielding that adjusted in real time to incoming weapons frequencies, learning as it was hit, becoming harder to penetrate with each exchange. The third was the one Donghyun was most proud of, relativistic kinetic impactors, long rods of dense composite material, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light and guided by targeting systems that could track a moving ship across 10,000 kilometers. No explosives, no energy signature that most galactic warning systems were calibrated to detect, just mass and velocity and mathematics. The Voreth had never seen anything like them. Almost no species in the galaxy had, because almost no species had thought to build them. Energy weapons were elegant. They were the mark of an advanced civilization, the kind of thing that looked impressive and proved you had mastered difficult science. Kinetic weapons were considered primitive, the blunt tools of early spacefaring societies that hadn't yet learned better. Donghyun had once told Murray that the most dangerous weapon was the one your enemy had decided you would never use. She had agreed with him completely. Jisoo was 29 years old and had never been in a real battle. She had run every simulation the defense fleet had, hundreds of times, and she had the highest tactical scores in her year group. She was calm in a way that went beyond training, a natural stillness that her commanding officers had noticed early and cultivated carefully. She led the first strike wing, 6 Aegis ships moving in a pattern she had designed herself, threading through the outer system in a flight path that kept them below the emission threshold of Voreth long-range sensors. The Voreth battle group saw them only when they were already within engagement range. What followed lasted 11 hours. Voreth were good fighters. They were experienced, aggressive, and their ships were built for combat. They hit the Aegis shields hard and fast and did not stop. But the adaptive shielding held, and with every exchange the Voreth found their weapons becoming less effective. The shields were learning their attack frequencies and compensating. Meanwhile, the EMP cores went to work. One by one, Voreth systems went dark. Engines failed. Weapon platforms locked up. Hulls remained intact. Crews were unharmed. When it was over, all 7 Voreth warships were floating silently in space. Dark, still, completely helpless. They had not been destroyed. Every crew member was alive. The ships could be repaired eventually with a great deal of work. Jisoo looked at the floating shapes on her display for a long moment, then turned to her co-pilot. "Broadcast on all frequencies," she said. "Let them see it." Back on the GSC orbital station, A junior observer from a small aquatic species, called the Marin, was the one who received the visual feed first. He stared at it for a long time before he thought to send it to the rest of the council. 7 warships, intact, dark, defeated so completely that there was nothing to even mourn. The observer found the GSC diplomatic coordinator, an insect-like creature who had worked in interstellar politics for 60 years and claimed nothing surprised him anymore. The coordinator looked at the feed. He was quiet for a very long time. "Get everyone to the chamber," he said finally. His voice was strange, flat in a new way. "What do I tell them?" the observer asked. The coordinator did not look away from the screen. "Tell them the humans didn't destroy the ships," he said slowly. "Tell them they took them apart. Tell them that's somehow worse." Murray received Jisu's mission report while sitting in her command chair above the Pacific. She read it once, confirmed all 47 crew members of the Aegis Wing had returned safely, and then closed her eyes for exactly 40 seconds. Then she opened them and began preparing the next phase. There was still a great deal of work to do. The emergency session was called 3 days after the Voreth fleet went dark. Every council species sent their senior representatives. The GSC Grand Assembly Chamber was full in a way it rarely was, packed with delegates from 12 different worlds, all of them talking at once, their voices overlapping in a noise that the translation system struggled to keep up with. The chamber itself was enormous, built to make any single individual feel small. Curved walls rose high above the floor. The central table was wide enough to land a shuttle on. The lighting was designed to be neutral, comfortable for as many different types of eyes as possible, which meant it was slightly dim for humans and slightly too bright for the Voreth. Junho sat in the human delegation seat and said nothing. He had a glass of water in front of him. He had not touched it. He was watching. That was something he had learned in 12 years at this table, that the most useful thing a person could do in a loud room was stay quiet and watch carefully, because loud rooms always eventually told you everything you needed to know. What he saw was not surprising. It was just finally visible. The session had been called officially to address the situation involving the Voreth Empire and Earth. But the way the agenda had been structured by Elder Sothrix, who chaired the council, and had been doing so for longer than most humans had been alive, told a different story. The first 2 agenda items were not about the destruction of Artemis Base or the death of 47 people. The first item was a formal review of Earth's military response. The second was a motion to classify Earth's IRONVIL fleet as an undeclared military escalation, in violation of GSC transparency protocols. The death of 47 humans was not on the agenda at all. Junho noted this. He did not react, he just noted it. Elder Sothrix opened the session with a long speech. He was an old creature, his body the shape of something between a large cephalopod and a deep-sea plant, and he moved slowly and spoke in long, flowing sentences that always sounded very reasonable no matter what they were actually saying. He spoke about the importance of proportional response. He spoke about the dangers of unilateral military action. He used the word stability 11 times. He used the word humanity twice, both times in a sentence that began with the phrase, "are concerned for." When he finished, 6 council members spoke in support of his position. They used different words but said the same thing. Earth had overreacted. Earth had hidden military assets. Earth had behaved in a way that threatened the peace of the galaxy. One of them, a delegate from a species called the Thessan who wore a formal robe that covered everything except 2 sets of eyes, suggested that Earth's seat on the council should be suspended pending a full review of its military programs. The Voreth delegation, sitting across the chamber with the careful stillness of a species that had just been publicly humiliated, said very little. They did not need to. Other people were doing their work for them. Junho waited. He let the session run. He let all of it land on the record. Then, when Elder Sothrix asked if the Earth delegation wished to respond, Junho stood up. He reached into his jacket and placed a small data crystal on the table. It was the size of his thumb. It looked completely ordinary. "Before I respond," he said, "I'd like to present some materials for the record." He pressed the crystal's activation point. Every screen in the chamber came to life at once. Hien had spent 9 years building what was now on those screens. She was Earth's covert intelligence director, a woman who had never once spoken at a GSC session or appeared in any public record connected to the Council. She had spent nearly a decade doing one thing: documenting every communication, every vote, every back-channel conversation that had been intercepted, decoded, and cataloged by Tihun's team. Every record that existed of what the Council had actually done, as opposed to what it had said. The screens showed all of it. The first set of records were authorizations, quiet, procedural documents buried in GSC administrative archives that showed the Council had granted the Voreth Empire expansion rights over 3 inhabited territories in the past 15 years. The species living in those territories had petitioned the Council for protection. The petitions were on the screens too, and beside each one, the Council's internal response, which in every case amounted to the same thing: filed and deferred indefinitely. The second set were communications, private messages between senior Council members, including several who were sitting in the chamber right now, discussing humanity's induction into the GSC. The messages were not complimentary. Some were clinical assessments of Earth's military capacity and how long it would take to neutralize. Some were direct conversations about how to keep humanity from developing independent political influence. One message, sent by a Council member who was currently in the process of pointing his 4 fingers at Junho in what his species used as a gesture of accusation, described humans as a temporary inconvenience that the Voreth will resolve for us. The third set were logs from the GSC Early Warning Network. They showed that 17 days before the Artemis base attack, the network had flagged Voreth fleet movement toward the solar system. The alert had been sent to the standard distribution list. Then the logs showed the access credentials, which Hien had matched to a Council staff office, had removed Earth from that distribution list. The alert had gone to every other Council member. It had not gone to Earth. 47 people had died because someone in this chamber had made sure they did not get a warning. The room was completely silent. Junho looked around the chamber slowly. He did not look angry. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down. "We didn't come to this Council for protection," he said. "We came to understand who you were." He paused. "Now we do." 2 Council members stood up at the same time and called for Junho to be removed from the chamber. One of them was already speaking to a security officer near the side wall. The security officer looked uncertain. He glanced at his communication device. Something had come through on it. Outside the station, at a distance close enough to be visible on the station's external sensors but far enough to be technically outside restricted space, 14 Aegis-class warships had appeared. They were not moving. They were not broadcasting any hostile signals. They were simply there, sitting in formation, completely still. Murray had sent one transmission on the station's standard frequency. It was not a threat. It contained no words at all. It was just a single, quiet ping. The kind of signal that meant, "We are here, we can see you, and we are paying attention." The security officer lowered his device. The Council members who had called for Junho's removal slowly sat back down. Junho straightened his jacket and looked at Elder Sothrix, who had not moved or spoken since the screens came to life. The old creature's many arms were very still. "I believe," Junho said calmly, "that the agenda needs to be reconsidered." Tihun sent the broadcast at exactly noon, GSC Standard Time. He did it from a small room in the Earth Embassy station with nothing but a terminal, a cup of cold tea, and the full weight of 9 years of Heian's work loaded onto a transmission array that had taken 3 technicians 6 hours to configure. The broadcast went out on every open frequency in GSC-monitored space. It was not targeted at any specific species or government. It was sent to everyone, every inhabited world, every relay station, every diplomatic outpost, every ship within range of a GSC communication node. The dossier was complete. Every document, every communication, every log, every authorization that had been on the screens in the assembly chamber, all of it, sent out into the galaxy for any species that wanted to see it. Tihan sat back in his chair when it was done. He picked up his cold tea, took a sip, and made a small, quiet sound of satisfaction. Within 6 hours, the galactic political map had begun to change. The first to respond were the Marin, the small aquatic species whose junior observer had been the one to receive the feed of the disabled Vorath fleet. Their government sent a public statement within 3 hours of the broadcast, formally withdrawing their membership from the Galactic Sovereign Council. The statement was short and used very direct language. It said that the Council had failed in its fundamental purpose, that the evidence released by the Earth delegation was clear and documented, and that the Marin people could no longer participate in a body that had knowingly allowed inhabited worlds to be attacked for political convenience. At the end of the statement, they formally requested Earth's protection for Marin space. By midnight, 3 more species had made similar announcements. 2 of them had been petitioners, the same species whose requests for help against Vorath expansion had been filed and silently buried. They were small. They were not powerful, but they were public and they were loud, and the fact that 4 separate civilizations had pulled away from the Council in a single day was the kind of news that could not be ignored or managed. On the Vorath homeworld, something had been building since the moment the fleet went dark. The Vorath were not a people who tolerated failure. Their entire civilization was organized around the principle that strength was the only real truth, that a species earned its place in the galaxy through victory, and that defeat was not just a military event, but a judgment on everything you were. It was a hard way to live. It produced extraordinary fighters and deeply fragile institutions, because a culture that cannot admit weakness cannot process loss in any healthy way. The High Warlord had made the decision to strike Artemis Base himself. He had presented it to his War Council as a demonstration of power, a quick, clean action that would show the galaxy how small and soft humanity was, force Earth to submit, and prove to the GSC that the Vorath were the kind of partner worth appeasing. It had seemed very logical at the time. Now his fleet sat dark and dead at the edge of the solar system. The broadcast was playing on every information channel in Vorath space. His own generals were watching the footage of their warships being systematically shut down by 14 human vessels and saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. The silence in the War Council chambers was the loudest thing the Warlord had ever heard. He was removed from command on the 4th day after the broadcast. It was done quietly, with minimal ceremony, a group of 6 senior generals arriving at his residence with documents that already had signatures on them. They did not do it because they disagreed with his goals. They did it because he had been visibly defeated, and a leader who had been visibly defeated could not lead a species built on the idea that leaders were strong. The new War Council sent a quiet message to Junho requesting preliminary ceasefire discussions. They worded it carefully, using language designed to sound like a mutual agreement rather than a surrender. Junho read the message. He showed it to Murray. She shrugged. He replied with a single sentence, "Send your representative to the GSC station at the time I specify. Come alone." They came. Murray's blockade had been in place for 8 days by then. 14 Aegis ships positioned around the 3 largest Vorath military shipyards, far from Earth, far from any world, just sitting in space between the yards and their supply routes, not firing, not threatening, just occupying the space that resupply convoys needed to use. the Voreth could have tried to force through the blockade. They had enough ships, but after the footage from the solar system, no Voreth commander was willing to be the next one to send a mission report that ended in 14 disabled vessels. The shipyards went quiet. The Voreth military economy, which had been running at full expansion speed for 30 years, ground slowly and painfully to a stop. Nari had been embedded with the fleet since the beginning, attached to Jisu's wing as a journalist. She was young and moved carefully, and always seemed to be in exactly the right place to document what mattered. She recorded the blockade not as a display of aggression, but as a display of stillness, humans sitting in the dark, saying nothing, doing nothing except being exactly where they needed to be. She sent her transmissions back to Earth and to every media outlet that would take them. They were watched by billions of people across dozens of worlds. What the galaxy saw was not a conquering force. It was not a fleet moving through space taking things. It was 14 ships holding position, unmoving, as though they had all the time in the universe and were perfectly comfortable waiting. Some species found it confusing. Many found it frightening. A few found something in it that they did not have a word for, a quality that felt something like respect. Back at the GSC station, the reckoning Nari had started using that word in her transmissions, and it had stuck, was moving through its final stages. Elder Sothrix had attempted to negotiate a private meeting with Junho 3 days after the assembly session. He wanted, he said, to discuss a quiet transition, a restructuring. He was willing to step down, to support reforms, to personally advocate for a new framework that centered smaller species' rights. He said all of this in the calm and reasonable tone he had been using for 60 years. Junho met with him once. He sat across from the old creature and listened to everything he said. When Sothrix finished, Junho was quiet for a moment. "You're offering a resignation," Junho said. "You want it to look voluntary. You want to control the story of how this ends." Sothrix said that was not entirely inaccurate. "A resignation is a favor," Junho said. "You don't get a favor." The formal proceedings took 4 more days. 3 council members were removed through a process that Heian's documents made unavoidably clear was the correct outcome. Their communications showed direct coordination with Voreth leadership, direct interference with Earth's warning systems, and documented suppression of protection requests from member species. 2 more chose to step down before the proceedings reached them. The Voreth were placed under a 50-year military restriction treaty, co-authored by Earth and 2 of the smaller species that had withdrawn from the Council, and then returned to participate in writing the terms. The treaty was specific and detailed, and had verification mechanisms built into it that the GSC had never used before. Murray had written those mechanisms herself. The Council's charter was rewritten. Earth held permanent veto power on any resolution involving member world security. It was the kind of structural change that should have been made decades ago, and had not been made because the species that would have needed to push for it were never powerful enough to demand it. When the final vote passed, the chamber was very quiet. Junho gathered his notes and put them in his bag. He walked out of the chamber the same way he had walked in, alone, unhurried, without ceremony. Outside in the corridor, Tihun was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Junho without saying anything. They walked together toward the docking bay. "How does it feel?" Tihun asked after a while. Junho thought about it seriously. "Like we fixed something that shouldn't have needed fixing," he said, "and like the fixing cost too much." Tihun nodded. They kept walking. The stars outside the station's wide observation windows were the same as they had always been, cold and distant, and completely indifferent to everything that happened beneath them. But the space between them was different now. Everyone in the galaxy could feel it, even if most of them couldn't yet say why. The whole thing lasted 19 days. From the moment the Voreth weapons hit Artemis Base to the moment the last signature went onto the restriction treaty, 19 days had passed. It was a short amount of time for something that changed the shape of galactic politics for the next generation. People would write about it later, historians, analysts, military scholars from a dozen different species. And most of them would spend a long time trying to explain how a civilization that had been traveling among the stars for only 200 years had managed to dismantle a political conspiracy that had been operating for decades and bring a warrior empire to a standstill in under 3 weeks. Most of them would miss the point. The 19 days were not the real story. The real story was the 40 years before them. Tihun's history was published 14 months after the treaty signing. It was a long book. He had written it carefully, the way he did everything, going back over documents and records and interview transcripts until he was certain that what he had written was accurate and fair, and told the whole truth without leaving out the parts that were uncomfortable. He spent a full chapter on Artemis Base, the 47 people who had died there, their names, their work, what they had been doing on the base in the weeks before the attack. He wanted the record to be clear about what the cost had been, because he knew how easy it was for the story of a conflict to become only about what happened to the winning side. He also included, near the end, a private journal entry that Murray had given him permission to use. She had written it 3 days after the treaty was signed, sitting alone in her command station above the Pacific. The entry was not dramatic. It was not triumphant. It was just honest. She wrote that she had spent her entire adult life preparing for something she had hoped would never happen and always believed would. She wrote that building the Aegis fleet and writing IRONVIL and doing all of it in secret had sometimes felt like a kind of madness, like being the only person in a room who could see a fire starting in the corner while everyone else talked about other things. She wrote that the hardest part was not the battle or the blockade or any of the decisions she had made during those 19 days. The hardest part had been the years before doing the work, staying quiet, and trusting that if the moment came, it would matter. At the end of the entry, she had written a single line. The most important weapon was the decision, made 40 years ago, to take ourselves seriously when no one else would. Tihun put that line at the beginning of the chapter, where it could be read before everything else. Murray herself had stepped down from active command 6 months after the treaty. It was her own decision, made quietly and without much ceremony. She had spent 23 years in the defense fleet and she was, she said, tired in a way that was not fixed by sleep. She took the new position of Galactic Security Architect, a role that had been created for her, because no one else had the background for it, and began the slow, complicated work of building something that should have existed before any of this happened. A real protection framework for smaller species in GSC space, with actual teeth in it, backed by actual force. She was very good at it. She found it, surprisingly, less exhausting than she expected. Building things, she discovered, was easier on the body than holding them together under pressure. Jisoo was promoted twice in the months following the conflict. She said very little in public about her role in the battle at the solar system's edge. In interviews, she gave credit to her wing, to Donghyun's ships, to the years of training the fleet had put in. She did not say much about herself. People wrote about her anyway. She was, according to most of the galactic coverage, the youngest tactical commander to have led a strike wing in a real engagement in the current century. She accepted this fact with the same calm she brought to everything else and went back to work. Donghyun retired from weapons engineering and spent his last working years teaching at the Defense Institute in Daejeon. His students later said he was a difficult teacher, demanding, exacting, almost impossible to satisfy with anything less than exactly right. They also said, universally, that he was the best teacher they had ever had, because he taught them that the thinking behind a weapon mattered more than the weapon itself. He taught them to ask not just what they were building, but what they were trying to make not worth doing. That question, he told them, was the only engineering question that actually mattered. Hien was never publicly identified as the author of the dossier. That was her preference, and everyone who knew respected it. She continued to work in intelligence for another decade, doing the kind of work that never appeared in any history book, but that made other people's work possible. She and Tihun had dinner together every few months, in a restaurant in Incheon that had terrible lighting and excellent food. And they talked about things that were mostly not classified, and sometimes about things that were. And they understood each other in the particular way of people who had spent years doing careful work that most people would never know about. 1 year after the treaty, Junho came home. He had not been back to Seoul in 3 years. The city looked exactly the same, which surprised him slightly even though he knew it would. The streets were loud. The signs were bright. The Han River was moving in its slow, patient way through the middle of everything. He walked for a long time without going anywhere in particular, just being in the city, listening to it. His daughter Yoonji was 15 now, and had grown several centimeters taller since he had last seen her in person. She was serious in the way teenagers are serious when they have been paying attention to something large and real, and she looked at him with the eyes of someone who had watched everything happen from a distance and had formed her own opinions about it. That evening they sat on the roof of their apartment building. The city spread out below them, all light and noise and movement. The sky above was clear and the stars were out, distant and cold and full of other worlds that were, now, watching Earth differently than they had 2 years ago. Yoonji sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, looking up. "Appa," she said, "now that they're all scared of us, are we the bad guys?" Junho looked at her. It was a good question. It was the right question. He had known somewhere that she would eventually ask something like it, because she was the kind of person who asked the questions other people stepped around. He did not answer immediately. He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. He thought about 47 names on a memorial wall at the edge of the Busan Harbor, which had been built 3 months ago, the names carved cleanly into pale stone. He thought about the Marin and the 2 other small species that had spent 15 years asking for help that had never come, and who were now in the process of building something real with Earth's support. He thought about Murray's journal entry and Donghyun's classes and Tihun's careful, honest book. He thought about Jisoo standing in space with 7 dark Voreth ships in front of her, and choosing to leave the crews alive. "We were never trying to be the good guys or the bad guys," he said. "We were just trying to make sure there was still a home to come back to." Yoonji was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "Did it work?" she asked. Junho looked at the city below. The lights that had been on when he left and were still on now. The streets that had kept moving. The people who had looked at the scar on the moon and been afraid and then gone back to their lives, not because they were careless but because they trusted that someone was doing what needed to be done. He thought about what it meant to carry that trust, what it meant to not let it be wasted. "Yeah," he said, "it worked." Yoonji looked back up at the stars. After a long moment, she nodded slowly, not like a child accepting an answer, but like a person filing a fact away, deciding what to do with it. Below them the city breathed. Buses moved. Someone laughed in the street. A dog barked twice and stopped. The Han River kept going, unhurried, the way it always had. The stars stayed where they were. And the planet beneath them, noisy, ordinary, stubbornly alive, turned in the dark the same as it always had. Unbroken, unbowed home.